Hi, I'm Nick Shell. This video is going to be the best video that has ever existed as far as a Bible study about baldness. Oh yes, you heard that right. It wasn't really my idea, it was my subscribers. They were commenting on a video I made called Nick's the No Balding Gene Through Natural Selection Black Mirror Episode Idea. One of my subscribers named Undying Will had this to say, quote, "Nick, can you prove that 2,000 years ago men were balding? I think they had a full body and head of hair like a gorilla, but today's world ruined everything with these poisonous shampoos, fake food, poisonous air, laboratory-created viruses, etc. All caps. We want proof, Nick." That's a challenge, end quote. And I am up for a challenge. And so I started exploring this. And by the way, as you listen to Undying Will, he's, just real quick, the theory he's throwing at us is modern day environment and what we eat has an effect on our ability to keep our hair. Basically, we're going bald because of that. That's his theory, which, you know, I can appreciate that. I'm a vegan. I don't use microwaves. I'm pretty out there when it comes to things like that. So that's I appreciate the challenge. He wants proof that hair loss existed 2,000 years ago. So I made a video 3 days later called "Did Jesus Have a Receding Hairline 2,000 Years Ago?" And to that, a fellow creationist and non-Republican, because most conservative Christians, as myself, are usually Republican, but I'm not. I'm a libertarian. And a creationist means that I believe the Bible is literal. I believe also that the earth is about 10,000 years old. I don't believe in evolution. I believe there are times the Bible is not literal. When Jesus tells the many parables he tells, like the story of the prodigal son, it's very obvious that's not a literal story. He's telling it as a story. But unless it specifically says it's a story being told, it's literal. Jonah and the big fish, literal. And Jesus references it later on when he's talking about being buried for 3 days like Jonah. All right, so here's a comment from Eric5335, quote, "Textual evidence proves baldness existed even well before 2,000 years ago. In Leviticus 13, talking about the regulations and signs of leprosy, it mentions baldness and that it's not a disease." So he mentioned that, and he also talks about Elisha the prophet. So let's explore that together. Let's go to Leviticus. Now, by the way, as far as how old the book of Leviticus is, somewhere between 500, 600, 700 years, I'm sorry, yes, somewhere between 500, 600, 700 years before Christ. So Jesus was here around 2,000 years ago. This was 500 or 600 or 700 years before he even got here. This was written, okay? So here it is, Leviticus 13:41, laws about leprosy. I'm reading Leviticus 13:40 through 42. Here it is, quote, "Now if a man loses the hair on his head, he is bald. He is clean. If his head becomes bald at the front and the sides, he is bald on the forehead, he is clean. But if on the bald head or the bald forehead there occurs a reddish-white infection, it is leprosy breaking out on his bald head or his bald forehead," end quote. Now, you're thinking, well, what is this even about? And I'll tell you. But either way, I've already told you this was written up to 700 years before Jesus came around. That means this is somewhere around 2,600 years old that this was written. That's how old this is. This is definitely, absolutely more than 2,000 years old because it preceded Jesus. People were reading this hundreds of years before Jesus was even born. And by the way, why is it talking about leprosy in the Bible? Because there was no cure for leprosy. And it wasn't until Jesus came around hundreds of years ago people were finally being cured of leprosy. And when he cured them of leprosy, what did he tell them? He said, "Don't tell anyone. Go first to the priest and show him that you've been healed." And the reason he did that, it was proof that he was the Messiah, because to have a disease that had never been cured and then all of a sudden it was cured, that was miraculous. And he was wanting to show the Jewish priest, hey, this is a miracle. People are being cured of this. So in order to do so, this text differentiates one thing, just being bald, like many men go bald, versus you being bald and also having leprosy. So I guess the leprosy was causing baldness as well. It's differentiated. Either way, the point is men were bald 700 years before Jesus was even around, and this is proof of that. Now let's move on. You've heard of Goldilocks and the three bears. Well, guess what came first? Elisha and the two bears. Now this is in 2 Kings 2:23 through 25. And by the way, Elisha was around about 900 years before Christ. So, again, we're pushing 3,000 years, not 2,000, but we're pushing closer to 3,000 years as far as when this happened and when this man lived. He was the prophet Elisha, which my understanding is even if you're Muslim, you identify Elisha as a prophet. So this even goes beyond Christianity and Judaism, and also goes even in Islam from what I can understand when I Googled Elisha. Okay, so here it is. Check out this text about Elisha and the two bears. This is 2 Kings 2 through 23-25. Here we go. Quote, "Then Elisha went up from there to Bethel, and as he was going up by the way, young lads, boys, came out from the city and mocked him and said," quote, "Go up, you bald head. Go up, you bald head." End quote. When he looked behind him and saw them, he cursed them in the name of the Lord. Then 2 female bears came out of the woods and tore up 42 lads of their number. End quote. So it's okay to laugh because that's like, wait, what? Yeah, it's what it says. So these bears killed 42 of the boys that were mocking this bald prophet, Elisha. So Elisha, again, close to 3,000 years ago, he was bald. Way before Jesus ever came around, Elisha was bald. Now, one closing thought to further prove how long men have been bald. And of course, these are the oldest texts. These were closer to 3,000 years ago. But if we, going back to my question about was Jesus bald? I'm going back to the Old Testament, or you could call it the Jewish Bible. Isaiah 53:2. Now imagine this. Jesus was prophesied hundreds of years before he ever even got here. There were prophets, there were Jewish prophets who predicted Jesus would be coming to save mankind from their sins. Isaiah 53:2, and by the way, if you want to look at when Isaiah, when he was around, let's Google that. It says 8th century BC. So about 800 years before Jesus, again, it's like consistently, nearly 1,000 years before Jesus got here, there's all this stuff coming up. And this is telling what Jesus was going to look like. I think that's fascinating. So about 800 years before Jesus was even born, you've got the prophet Isaiah predicting what he's going to look like, and here's what it says in Isaiah 53:2. Quote, "He had no beauty or majesty to attract us to him, nothing in his appearance that we should desire him." End quote. So 800 years before Jesus was born, we had this going on. And imagine that for a moment. We had Jesus, who was Jewish. It said he's not going to be specifically a beautiful man. He's just an average looking man. You're not going to see him and think, wow, this is the Messiah. You're not going to know that by looking at him. I think that's important because let's put this into context. Think about the average Jewish man. And I've made videos about this before. If you're Jewish, you fall in the category of the same fate as of men of European descent, of Middle Eastern descent, of Indian descent. You're more likely to go bald sooner than someone who's of Asian or even of African descent. Okay? So, and even myself, my great-grandmother, I've recently officially learned was Sephardic Jewish. So even part of me is Jewish. But it's interesting because, and also we know that Jesus was around the age of 33 when he was crucified. Of course, he came back to life after that and ascended to heaven, but he was age 33 when he died. Somewhere around age 33 from what we can look at the text and understand. So imagine today, a Jewish man, aged 33, what would he look like? I theorize he'd be around in Norwood 2, maybe in Norwood 3 even. Arguably, let's compromise. Norwood 2.5. I theorize that Jesus was a Norwood 2.5 because he was just an average guy. If he had a perfect head of hair, then that'd be one reason we think he's a particularly attractive man. So let's not make him a Norwood 1. Let's say best case scenario, he was Norwood 2. Worst case scenario, Norwood 3. But I wouldn't say beyond Norwood 3 because then he'd be balding and then that's taken away from him just being an average man. I think average, especially if you're Jewish, means you're going to be somewhere between Norwood 2 and 3 if you're age 33. So there you go. There is the first Bible study about balding. Now, as far as proof that these men were balding 2,000, 3,000 years ago, it all comes down to this. Do you believe the Bible to be real? Do you believe it's truly been around as long as people have been talking about it? That's up for you to decide. As far as finding proof of a frozen Neanderthal, we can't do that, but we can do this. There's your proof. Thanks for watching the first ever Bible study on balding.